Hey everybody, this is Josh Hallmark from True Crime Bullshit, and I thought as we were getting into the holiday season, it would be a great time for a bunch of true crime podcasters to come together and do what I'm calling, it was originally calling it Crime on Crime, but that has some very different implications. So I guess just like actors on actors, we're going to get together in small groups and talk about true crime, the experience of creating true crime podcasts, and I guess just our feelings and thoughts on different cases, each other's work, and the medium at large. And for this group, I'm here with the Captain from True Crime Garage and Charlie Worrell from Crimelines. Hi, guys.
Hello.
How are you?
I'm fantastic.
It's a Wednesday morning. It's great.
Love Charlie's voice.
And me
Thank
too.
you.
It's like very soothing in an unexpected way. It's like I feel like
It's my maternal nature coming through on the mic.
I think it is. I feel very unjudged when I'm with you, which is an oxymoron, but
I was going to say, usually we're sitting there judging other people together.
maybe that's why. Maybe I feel safe because the judgment is usually external.
Exactly.
Yeah, no, it's funny. As we are recording this, I'm done with an episode and I'm waiting for music clearance and my editor to finish, and I thought that would be a good jumping off point. When I finish an episode, I like to post it immediately because for all the interim time, I sit there second guessing everything I've just created. And so right now I keep being like, should I go change this thing? Should I rewrite this? So I don't like having episodes in limbo. What is your process? I guess both like literal, like from concept to research to creating, and then also emotional. Like, what's it like for you to like create and birth episodes week after week?
I do pretty much my whole show by myself. So I find that the research and the writing process are so linked. If I get research from someone else, it almost takes me just as much time getting up to speed on the information, synthesizing it, deciding how I want to say things, how I want to structure it, as if I just did the research myself, because they're just so linked. I write, I rewrite, I record, I rewrite as I'm recording. I don't know if you do that, where you're like, oh, that sounded really good when I wrote it, but it's not really sounding good as I'm saying it. So it's this constant rewrite. But like you, Josh, if I have something sitting there too long, I'll be like, well, let me go back over it just one more time. And then I'm like, okay, well, let me just re-record this one section because I don't think I emphasized the right words. So I also have to, I don't necessarily, well, sometimes I have to release it right away because I hit my deadline. And that's like just a, procrastination issue. But sometimes
That has never happened to me.
Oh, yeah, I know. And like that actually came up. This is my second one of these bonus episodes. And we actually discussed how we can't talk to you on Wednesdays because your episode comes up Thursday. So you ignore all of us the day before your episode comes out because you're busy. But I mean, sometimes I have to get it out just because I hit the deadline. But a lot of times I have to do a mental block and say, okay, that episode is done and move on just so that I don't go back to it.
Ours is a little different because we record live together and then I edit afterwards. So if Nick misspeaks or something, he tries to correct it in the moment. And then I kind of take mental notes, fix that error. I used to think that every episode that we're going to put out could change the world. I think we made it too precious. And I think sometimes you just kind of have to let it go because some of the episodes that you record and you're like, after we record it, I have the opportunity, to make it better as I edit it. But, you can only polish a turd so much, but some episodes that I just don't think are that interesting. The audience loves those ones. And then some of the cases that I can't get enough of, they're so tired of us talking about. So, but I think, it just comes down to just trying to be as honest with yourself as possible. And I think that comes across in everybody's work. Any show that's been doing this for longer than a couple of years, I think it's the honesty. But like what Charlie said, and I'm not going to name any names, but there's a lot of shows that people have come to me and said, I don't listen to their show anymore. I can tell they don't write their own material.
Yeah, I agree. I think like the research thing is interesting because I've had people do like research projects. So my research team is mostly just like we do our own, small research or we look into different things and then we have big long group discussions about it. And it's never necessarily for a specific episode. It's just more of a holistic research workshop.
Right.
But I've had a few times where people have like researched for a specific episode and I have a really hard time with it because it's like, well, I don't know like what you've looked at and what you haven't. Like, I don't know how you got here. Of course, they're like citing their sources, but I'm like what got left out? Or like,
Right.
did you pursue this avenue? Or like, did you pursue this and it led to a dead end? And to me, I think it creates more questions than it does help me in my process. And then I also agree, like the authenticity thing, especially for shows like us who in the true crime world are like ancient at this point, where
Yes.
I think at a certain point, people are like, okay, no, like we've heard this. Like they want you to be yourself, which I have a hard time with. Tina Fey, there's this quote from her that I both love and scares the shit out of me, where she's like, authenticity is dangerous and expensive. And that's my big fear is like the more people get to know me, the more they can project shit onto me and the more they can scrutinize me and the more they can decide they don't like me. But in the same time, like the longer they spend with me, the greater the desire is to get to know me and hear my feelings about stuff. So it's this very delicate balance.
Yeah, but you have to remember what Adam Sandler said in Big Daddy. You're not mad at me. You're just mad at your dad. And I was told to hang myself multiple times when we first started the podcast. And especially for somebody I struggled with depression and I actually just went through a period of my life where for like 2 years, I actually was thinking about hanging myself. So to actually have somebody that I don't even know say, I love this podcast, but you ruin it. It's like, well, one, there wouldn't be a podcast if I didn't help Nick create the podcast.
Right.
There's something clicked in me where I was just like, I just started apologizing. I am sorry that you have to put up with my nonsense to enjoy his show. And I appreciate you listening. And most of the time people would write back and be like, I'm so sorry. I should have never said that. And because I think people forget that we do have feelings, even though I don't have big feelings.
Sure.
I'm almost dead inside. Hey, if you watch Dawson's Creek, like the whole series, like more than 15 times, that might kill you.
I will say your Dawson's Creek viewing is a legend within the podcast community. It's amazing.
It's true. And it's partly my fault because I was just the first time I ever met you. Because here, like a great example, I had very preconceived notions about you. And then I met you and most of them were like wildly inaccurate. And I think the Dawson's Creek of it all was like such a great metaphor for that. Like it doesn't sum up who you are as a person, but I think it is so in opposition to how I think many people perceive you who have never met you. And so to me, it's like a beautiful allegory and also like a funny allegory.
Well, it's tough though too, because I mean, in simplest form, when I joined the jazz band in high school, I remember my director after a couple of weeks said to me, "You're not good at this. I heard you're good at sports." And that really bothered me because I come off as a Bob Ruff. I come off as a Bob Ruff, but inside I'm more a Josh Hallmark. So it's a weird world that I've navigated. Well, and the Dawson's Creek thing is super weird too, because it wasn't like I watched it in high school. And, it's like when people watch Friends because it's just nostalgic. It's like, no, I started watching Dawson's Creek in my 30s. So, but that was, heavily medicated, heavily depressed. And it was, I literally thought like by watching this show, it's going to give me some answer to life, that I missed out on. So, as funny of a thing that it is, when people like make fun of it, I'm always like, to me, I'm like, it's very depressing to me that I've watched this show as many times as I have. And anytime I'm in like a bad place in life, I started over again, and I tell myself, "What are you doing? This is self-sabotage. You know that she picks Pacey. You know she picks Pacey."
It's funny because I did the same thing with Grey's Anatomy in my 20s, where I saw Meredith Grey and was like, wow, I've never felt more seen. And now, 20 years later, I go back and I'm like, wow, that is a tough existence.
But can you imagine if you tried to rewatch? I mean, what is it, 20 some seasons?
Captain, this is where like the joke's on me. I have.
Well, I have to say that I think this kind of goes to that authenticity thing and what people see and hear of us. They're only getting part of it when we're doing our podcast. Even if we have a personality driven show, they're only getting part of us, and they're kind of building a person around that perception that might not be who we actually are. And then we do episodes like this where we're just talking open and honestly, and people are surprised to kind of see the other sides of us. So I think that when you're listening to somebody on a podcast that is about one thing, like Israel Keys or just true crime in general, just remember you're seeing a small amount of that person and don't build a whole thing around that, because it might not be an accurate perception of who they are. And on the other hand, like, we have to get used to that. We have to know that happens and try to not take it personally.
Well, and it's tough too, because like when Nick came up with this idea, I mean, we were in his garage and he said, what if it was just like this? You know, we're just sitting around drinking beer, talking about crime. And I'm like, but I don't really drink that often. And he was like, well, but I do. But if you listen to the show, he sounds sober the whole time. And I could be drinking orange juice and I sound drunk out of my mind. So that's a difficult thing too, especially if you have I'm going to use a Rocky quote, a relaxed brain that, you know, sometimes I come off as, you know, like this bumbling drunk. And so when you get people that like nobody likes to listen to themselves talk. And we have to not only talk, but then we have to edit it down. And then to have somebody say, oh man, the captain was super drunk on this episode. And you're like, I haven't had a drink in the last 2 months, maybe, you know? So if I sounded drunk, I was just sounding stupid, you know?
That's my like post event feeling, is like, I have such severe social anxiety, which I don't think people would know when they hear these conversations because I'm super comfortable with you guys. And then also, like, we go to these events and they're like summer camp because we'll get to see each other maybe twice a year. And so we're like having fun and celebrating. And so, like, the way people at these events see us is not a holistic view of who we are as people. And I always think, like, you know, I'll be hungover on the last day and I'm like, oh God, everyone saw me like wasted 3 nights this weekend. And now they think that's who I am, but it's really just in response to being in like a high pressure, socially awkward situation with people I see twice a year where I'm like partying and having fun. And so it is this weird thing where people get such small windows into who you are, and then those windows become the reality of who you are, which is tough. And I see, like, that's the shit that like really bothers me. I don't mind unfair criticisms. I mean, I do, but I don't like spend my nights like crying over them. What bothers me is like the ethos of the unfair criticisms of like people who go onto Reddit and say crazy things about you who have never met you and don't interrogate that at all. Where it's like, oh, that's the world we live in now, where we can like build a model of someone based on very, very, very little information, whom we've never met, and present that to the world, and most of the world buys into it. And so like, I don't care that people say shitty things about me. I care that like no one second guesses that in a broader sense.
I hate being misunderstood. And that's what I feel like this is when someone posts something on Reddit and says, oh, well, you know, Charlie, I can't listen to her show. She's such a know-it-all. I'm like, but I'm not. I'm pedantic. And that is not the same thing as being a know-it-all. But maybe I'm being a know-it-all by pointing that out. But anyway, so now I've just made it a joke on my show that I'm pedantic all the time, because I am. But I was like, no, you don't get it. It's not what I feel like I'm putting out in the world, but it is what they're receiving. And I have to just accept it and move on, because I'm not going to change and act not, you know, intelligent or whatever they're getting from what I'm doing I'm not going to stop doing that because they're misunderstanding it. But I do hate being misunderstood.
Yeah, but there's also just, and I can only speak for men, but I know that there's men out there that are afraid of strong, intelligent women. I've always liked that, and I think the true crime space has really kind of been a platform for intelligent, strong women, and I think that's a cool thing. Even though we used to be called misogynist every episode, like these guys just sound like two drunken frat boys. I'm like, me and Nick are the farthest from frat boys. But you guys probably get this though too. I hate when people assume an opinion I had about a case that I never gave.
Yes, I get that all the time.
I know Josh gets it all the time because I'll see it on Reddit or wherever where they're like, well, Josh thinks this. And I'm like, he absolutely does not. Why are you saying that? And it's just they picked up something in the episode that hit them, that they misunderstood the context of, maybe. I don't know, but I definitely see that happen to Josh. I one time had someone email me and they're like, I can't believe this is clearly a wrongful conviction and you just presented the state's case and you didn't even present the defense case at all. And then I was like, what in the world are they talking about? Because I said, this is a wrongful conviction case. Like, clearly I gave my opinion. And then like 6 weeks later, she emailed me and said, hey, I re-listened and I misunderstood what you were saying. I was just so upset about it. And I was like, oh, okay. Well, she did ask if she could call me to apologize. And I was like, no, ma'am, I do not need to give you my phone number.
Well, and I think if you created enough content, like, here's my opinion. If you want to give no information about yourself, awesome. If that's how you choose to do it. And if you want to have a show where you talk about what you ate for lunch and what's your favorite coffee and you want to give every detail of your life, that's cool too, or somewhere in between. I like that I have a partner in the show that he is very strict about. He will not talk politics, period.
Yeah, it's funny. I think, like, as a gay man, politics is so intrinsic to how I exist in the world and how I perceive and synthesize everything I'm doing or researching or experiencing. And so I have such a hard time with it because, like, yes, I don't want to alienate people. And I also want to have productive conversations. So it's very hard in a podcast to, like, veer into politics, whether it's like apt or relevant or not, and then not have like a full productive conversation about why you have that view or like why that view is important or why that view should even be considered. I think it's such a tricky fine line because crime in many ways is political, and so it's hard to have this one conversation without bringing in at least like subtext of politics. I've been able to do it with Unsafe Spaces, but that's because it's a show about marginalized people. But I always envy like Wine and Crime, who just say it and then move on. And
they do not care.
Yeah.
I have found that sometimes politics does come up in my show because I do cover a lot of the legal side of things. And the people who make our laws are politicians. So it comes up, and it came up in a recent episode because the sheriff that is overseeing the case that the family is not happy with got a political appointment recently that was then revoked. And so my audience will clearly recognize his name if they read the news because it just happened. So I do address that. But I mean, I also have a different view of what is political and what is not political. Like saying that Indigenous women go missing at rates higher than any other ethnicity or race within our country is a fact. It's not a political stance.
Right.
However, some people interpret that as a political stance.
Yeah. Oh, man.
I mean, we could be getting into some uncomfortable ground and want to shift here. I understand that. But it is... How many emails do we want to get?
That's the thing, too, is like we have the choice to read those comments or not. Our episodes get posted to our feed and then they go to our YouTube. And I never check YouTube comments after the first day. This person loves to say, like, skip to marker 6, 6 minutes into the show because everything before that is garbage.
I see people do that on YouTube all the time.
And my reply to them was, in fairness, it's probably all garbage, But my father was a detective, so it's like some of what we're doing is playing make believe, that I'm going to be able to look into a case from a bird's eye view and bring something to the table that gets that case solved. And I have like a 6-day turnaround to do so every week. That's just not likely. And
yeah, that's interesting. I think for me, like, it's such a fine line between interrogating someone's actions and then like critiquing or criticizing someone's actions. And I just did a 2-parter, which the first episode was one of my favorite I've ever done, and the second episode was the least favorite episode I've ever done. But like, I had a fundamental issue with the way that the family was handling the disappearance. And I think like I had to, and it was also biased because there was like familial alienation involved, which is something I've dealt with. And so I was trying not to see it through the lens of my own experience, but also like it was so important to me to like make sure people knew like the family can't speak holistically about this missing person if they haven't talked to him in 3 years. They can't say like he didn't have a job or he didn't have money because they don't know. And then there was another case that we still haven't covered yet that we have like thousands of pages on, where the gentleman was like out and proud, but his family was not, I wouldn't even say condoning of it. They refused to acknowledge that he was gay. And I think that has created a massive barrier in media coverage of his case, which there's hardly any. And it's like, how do you do that? Like, because part of me is like, well, you can't out someone, whether they're dead or missing or whatever, but this guy was already out and he like had boyfriends and was out in the community. And so like by reporting on that, am I harming his family? Am I alienating his family? It's tough. It's a very hard thing to do. And I think we need to hold people not so much accountable, but to the truth without necessarily criticizing them, because there's so much we don't know.
When I was looking into the Brian Schaefer case, a missing man from Columbus, Ohio, there's all these rumors about his sexuality and experimentation, and then it's like, do you put that out to the world? But at the end of the day, all we can do is put out every piece of information that we have learned that we know is factual. We're not speculating that he had a homosexual relationship at some point. It's not speculation, it's fact. And all you're trying to do in each case is to put as many puzzle pieces on the table. Now, again, if somebody said, well, I don't put every puzzle piece on the table for the public because that's not what kind of content I want to put out there, that's up to them. But for me, I thought it was important. And like you said, I disagreed with the way he really hasn't looked for Brian, or it doesn't seem like he's been involved in his brother's missing case much at all. And I was very critical of that when we first started. And now, maybe I think in the true crime space, we put too much emphasis or too much speculation on what we think we would do in a certain situation. If it was my brother that went missing, then I would do this. And so and that's very James Renner, and not to call him out, but
we can disagree with something while still understanding why it happened in that situation, even if we don't think it was the right thing to do, because we all do things in our lives that aren't the right thing to do. And looking back, even we know that. But kind of to the point of what to include and what not to include about someone's personal life or the family's life, when it comes to unsolved cases, I feel like it's really hard to say what's not relevant because we don't know the answer. Therefore, it may be relevant. If you got arrested for, a pot possession 20 years ago, probably not relevant. I'm not going to bring it up. But if, the person was doing serious hard drugs 6 months before they disappeared, it may be relevant. When it comes to solved cases, we get that broader view of what is and is not relevant to the case. So it's easier to just know what to leave in and leave out. But like in unsolved cases, like you're talking about, we don't know what's relevant and what's not until it's solved. So we need to put that information out there so that the person can be found or the killer could be found, because that's how they generate tips. Something gets to the right person and they remember something.
Well, and Charlie, in your case, it's probably harder because there's sometimes that I say something on the show or Nick says something on the show, and 5 minutes later, the person saying, hey, we should probably edit that out. I'm not comfortable with sharing that. And then you have a soundboard, somebody going, well, no, I think that's good information, or no, I agree with you. We should cut that out.
This is where having a network of other podcasters is helpful, because Josh can tell you how many times in kind of our group chat, it's going to be something like, hey, I use this word for, a marginalized community, but I'm not sure that's the current language. How would you say this? Okay, I'm thinking about putting this in the episode. Here, can you read this paragraph over for me? And we do that a lot because we don't have a sounding board, particularly in the moment when we're sitting like by ourselves recording. So you have a sounding board automatically. I've had to kind of seek them out.
Yeah, it's funny. I think about that in the process of like forgetting stuff or like not being maybe as PC driven or forward as you'd like to be. Like, I have literally a room full of binders just on the keys case. And like most of that information is in my brain at all given times. And so like you sit down and you write a script and you rewrite it and it becomes like word salad at a certain point. And then you're like, how do I pronounce this? Or like, what's the word I'm supposed to be using for this? And it just gets lost amongst everything else. And then that's the thing people will glom onto. And it's like, dude, like I just spent 4 weeks researching where all the trash in Portland goes. Like, fuck off if I like didn't pronounce this right or like didn't say the most up to date, like correct word for something. Like it like, again, it goes back to perception versus reality.
Yeah. Or sometimes Nick is reading the actual report from the police and he's using the terminology they use. And people will say that, well, that's not correct. And it's like, it's not Nick. That's not Nick's words. That's a report he's reading. Again, and then I think sometimes with the podcast, it's tough because there's a big difference if I sit down at my desk and turn everything off except for audio book, how I'm going to receive that information, as opposed to if I'm listening to This American Life while I'm doing the dishes, how I'm going to receive that information. So I think sometimes as content creators, we have to also give the audience a pass that they might have been running a marathon while they listened to the show and they didn't receive the information in the correct way.
I think we also, though, have the privilege, too, of like understanding what happens behind the scenes and like understanding where mistakes get made or where stuff gets overlooked. And so it can be challenging when like you have the privilege of this information that the audience doesn't necessarily have, but then the audience is using it against you. And you're like, I wish I could show you what happens behind the scenes so you understand, but I also can't hold you accountable for like not knowing what you don't know.
And I think that goes with the criticism as well. It's that, it sounds like we're closed to criticism. We're not really receptive to it, but some of it is in the delivery. I don't need anyone to coddle me. You could say, hey, you got this wrong. You don't even have to be nice about it, but just don't be mean about it. And so I think sometimes the mean criticism, kind of like the captain was saying earlier, just the actual violent, feedback that we will sometimes get, it drowns out the people who actually have a point that maybe we should say something a little differently. Maybe we need to keep something else in mind, because it's just at some point you start getting defensive. I feel like I've moved past that point, but early on, because of the like mean criticism, I started getting a bit defensive to all criticism, and that's never a good place to be.
Yeah, I only now respond to like direct, not even critique, like a direct discourse. Like, and granted, I very, very rarely read any comments, emails from listeners, just because, like you said, like we've had to create, or what has been created for us, like a pretty tough shell. And so like I don't invite anything in that I don't have the bandwidth to take on. But the ones I do see that I respond to are like, why did you make this choice? Rather than like, fuck you for thinking this, or like, I can't believe you did this. It's like, why did you make this choice? Because for me, that shows like not a judgment, a curiosity, and a willingness to have a conversation about whatever it is that they didn't like, but also an understanding that like there may have been decisions made that they don't know that impacted why I made that choice. And so I think if you actually like care about something and want to see it resolved or express your opinion in a meaningful way. It's about creating discourse and not criticism.
But I think it's also difficult. I don't know if you guys have found this difficult. So in my early 20s, one of the things I did because I was a musician, is I'd get hired by independent labels or artists to help them with social media. And so when we started the podcast at first, we're like, we're going to have no social media. And we just kept on having listeners go, it'll be a great way to help build an audience. And it was, but then I got sucked back into that world. And I like living in a world that's less in the social media world. So do you guys find that hard to balance in your life?
When I started podcasting, every podcast had a podcast group. So that was one of the first things you did on Facebook, was start a podcast group. And it turned out to really be a massive headache. Like, a lot of the people were really nice, but it's hard to moderate people when they start disagreeing. Okay, well, now I have to decide, are you being too mean? Or are you not? One time, my old podcast got a bad review because they didn't like how we handled something in the Facebook group. So with Crimelines,
it has nothing to do with the podcast. Really.
Absolutely nothing to do with the podcast. And so what I ended up doing with Crimelines is, like, I have a social media presence, but anyone will tell you I'm not there very often. I rather keep social media to my personal life, where I'm enjoying sharing pictures of going to the park and things like that. That's how I want to spend my time on social media, balancing personal social media and then this podcast social media. It's just too much for me. I do not have the bandwidth for it.
Yeah, when I started, I loved it, but I think it's because the show was smaller, and I think the social media landscape was totally different 8 years ago from what it is today. Back then, people joined a group because they were passionate about a topic and wanted to have meaningful conversations about it. And I think now, the internet exists for research and trolling. And then as the show got bigger, obviously, there were disparate points of view, and the passion turned into anger, and it just got really ugly. And then it's just now a new medium for people to say mean things to me, where they are confident I'll see it. And so I am less and less involved. I also think there's been a stronger need to protect what I call my 99%, like the 99% of me that people don't have access to or don't see or don't know. And so, yeah, I think that there's a great value to it. And I was telling the boys from Somewhere in the Pines, you need to have a Facebook group, especially this early on in your career. But as I've had the, luxury of getting bigger, I feel less and less the need to be involved in it. And I think also I need a separation, and unfortunately, there's no way to control that. People will message me about keys or message me about my bad thoughts on my personal Facebook or on my personal Instagram, or track down my Gmail address, and I'm I'm not messaging the AT&T rep on his home email address complaining about my phone service. So please don't do the same with me, because I know that my true crime bullshit or Studio Both and social media is the easiest to find. It's harder to find my personal stuff online. So I'm you're putting in a lot of effort to reach me where no one's home.
Well, I turned off instant messaging on all my podcast social media. So, if you want to talk to me, you are going to have to email me. I just need everything funneled. If I could have all my DMs forwarded to my email and funneled into a folder, I would do that. It's just I can't have 700 places to look. So people have to email me. And as soon as I turned it off, I started noticing I was getting a lot more message requests on Facebook on my personal one from people I'm not friends with. And I checked, and they were all podcast related. But I turned them off on my podcast stuff, not because I don't want people to reach out to me. It's just I cannot manage, 4 different mailboxes. I need everyone to send everything to one place.
Yeah, I remember when my grandmother died, I was on Facebook, messaging with my cousins. And it was my personal Facebook, had nothing to do with the show. And throughout all these messages were messages from listeners being does this mean we're not getting a new episode? or what do you think about this and keys? And I'm dude,
let me breathe for a minute.
Yes, truly.
Yeah, but it's not to talk shit to ourselves, but I also kind of feel we're lucky to I'm lucky that I get to work at home. I'm lucky that I get to, have a subject that other people are fascinated in, that because of this job, quote unquote job, I get to dive into a different case every week and share my thoughts and opinions. And some people are going to like it and some people won't. But we all have met super talented individuals that have put out content and they just didn't get any traction.
Mm-hmm.
And some of these individuals put out hundreds of episodes and just eventually one day just decided to fold up shop, And so the fact that, if you can make a living doing it, it's, it is a privilege. And it's also a weird thing too. Like Josh was saying, podcasting back in the day was so different than it is now, because everything now is networks and they've swallowed up and they own everybody now.
Right.
And even though they might not own us because we're not a part of a network, we're of the old school model where the listeners owned you and they took ownership of you, and they would fund your beer fund, or, go back to like Sword and Scale where, hey, this costs money to put out. I need to raise money, and he'd do a GoFundMe or whatever. And so, before ads became a big part of a lot of people's shows, we were supported so much by the listeners. So I think some of original true crime podcasts, we feel maybe a sense of obligation to the listener, because how much they supported us, in the beginning. If that makes any sense.
Yeah, I think of the listeners as shareholders. Like, they have a vested interest in the product because they have invested so much of their time and often money into it. But then they also are not a part of the decision making and don't see the machinations, that go on behind the scenes. And I think you're right. Like, that creates a challenging dichotomy of being like, I'm so invested in this, but I have very little control over it. And I want my opinions to be heard. But my opinions don't necessarily have the value to the greater podcast that they do to me.
There's a social media influencer named Elise Meyer. She does very wholesome kind of storytime content, sometimes some music. And due to just an onslaught of negativity, she took a social media break. And a lot of people are like, oh, you bullied her off the internet. Whereas other people were like, look, she sits at her house and does a story time for an hour and makes all this money. So John Green, who's a YouTuber and an author, said that, being in that position where you're a public figure is a privileged position. And so your problems are privileged problems, but that doesn't make them not problems. So yeah, it is absolutely a privileged problem that I have to sit at my house in my basement in my pajamas all day to work and support my family. And I get to do it all in comfort. And yes, I get the emails of people telling me how amazing I am. And all of that really is a privilege. The downsides, it doesn't mean they're not also problems. They're just privileged problems.
It's interesting because I wrote down a bunch of topics for this conversation, and
we got to one.
we got to, well, and it wasn't even on my list. And I think it speaks more to where the culture is, because I think 5 or 6 years ago, this conversation is a conversation you might have for 15 minutes once a year. But I have found I'm having this conversation with other creators more and more and more frequently. And so I agree, and I wish, because it's too late now, that had been what this conversation was predicated on, is it is a privilege, and these are privileged problems, and we are so fucking lucky to get to do what we love, turn it into a career, and have people who support that, even if that support often comes through critique. But also, it speaks volumes to the culture that more and more often people are feeling the weight and burden of criticism that either is unfair or fair criticism that is presented in unfair ways.
Not to have the straight white man cut you off, but
I'm used to it. You're fine.
But we're talking about privilege. This is something I know a lot about. We're also in a state too where I think people are struggling with their worth. And I saw this. Rainn Wilson had a podcast, but it was just a clip of the podcast where his guest was saying, like, we only value as a society money, and we only and I think, I'm not saying that's for everybody, but I think as somebody that struggled with self-worth and self-care and self-love and all that stuff, like, to me, the more I've worked on that and the more I've focused on, if somebody doesn't have weight in my life, that their opinion doesn't get weight. I'm the one that gets to choose if it has weight or not. Does that make any sense?
Mm-hmm.
Totally.
And you've probably seen this with other true crime podcasters when you're at these events and they're talking about contracts, and they're talking about maybe they're getting less ads, or maybe they're getting more, or their network is forcing them to be a part of the bonus content, or everybody loves to bitch about Ashley Flowers. You know,
I bitch about anyone who makes more money than me.
Yeah, and
which includes you too.
but I think it's like like, we have to, not just as content creators, but people in general, value ourselves more and care about ourselves more. And just like you said, like, people are going on and talking shit to people online, and that is not a value or something that they would do in real life because it wouldn't be acceptable, but they're allowing it to be acceptable in a different space. But that's them valuing themselves less. And am I making any sense here?
Yes, absolutely. And I think, like, going back to it is such a great full circle thing, is like, we don't show that on the shows because either there's no room for it, or the audience doesn't want to hear it, or, authenticity is dangerous and expensive. But, like, that also, I think, adds to the critique, is because people don't see that, they presume or assume that, like, we are not holding ourselves accountable, or we are not interrogating ourselves. I've never met a more self-deprecating, unkind to themselves group of people than true crime podcasters. And I wish the audience could see that, because I think they think we hold ourselves on a pedestal, and actually we're just beating ourselves up around the clock.
Yeah, but then there's also the host that you meet that, and I don't want to give away names, but they start creating this fake, what is it called, vibrato, or I can't speak.
Bravado.
Maybe I should speak for a living. No, but it's like they start creating this sense of, me and Nick got into this big argument because I was at Crime Con. It was, I want to say it was Nashville, or no, it was what was the other one? New Orleans. We're in New Orleans, and I was walking around, and I saw all these true crime podcasters. Like, by the 6th hour of being there, everybody was like peacocking and strutting their stuff and sticking out their chest, because all these people were coming up to them and wanting pictures and autographs. And I thought it was hilarious because I've been on concert cruises where you're opening up for 311 or Kid Rock, or, I opened up for Kanye one time. Nobody at that show wanted my autograph. I could have pretended that I was like some big star, but they were there to see Kanye. So I think maybe some of my background allows me to view it as like, I'm just a regular person, just like the listener. I've just spent a little more time maybe working on the cases and then presenting the cases. But I think even the guys that puff up their chest, they're doing it because they're not great at self-love, and they're not great at self-confidence, and they're not. I feel like I'm not making any sense at all.
No,
but
no, you're making perfect sense.
You're making sense, and it's actually reminding me of something that Josh said at a podcast event we were at, where we each had like a tablecloth and like some stickers, and that was our entire table set up. And then we look around, and people who were brand new had these full size like backdrops and all this stuff, and we're like, oh, I think there's a difference in what we think when we're coming into this space, because we started when it really was just a bunch of regular people with a microphone. We all had our Blue Yetis fired up, and we were making podcasts to whoever listened. And then people coming in now that celebrities are podcasting and corporations are involved, they see it as as a little bit different than we do, where we see ourselves as just regular people. I mean, anyone who's gone to an event that I've been at, and I know you and Josh because I've seen you guys at these events, they know we're just hanging out. Like we're just hanging out with everybody. It's very calm and chill, and
Yeah.
it's like there's not a lot of peacocking happening. But so I mean I think it's just the podcast landscape has changed a lot. We all sound like, pod grandfather Justin Evans when we talk about it. But, it's so different now. When people ask me for advice to get started on a podcast and to grow, I'm like, I have no idea.
But not to talk shit about Justin.
You can. No, I'm just kidding.
But that's a great example. All of a sudden, one day, he makes this big point of like, we're the OGs. Well, congratulations, Justin. You did a couple episodes before other people did episodes. And they also talked a lot about MMA and Bigfoot.
They did.
And which is fine. And those were my favorite episodes. And I've told Justin to his face, shame on you for not talking about aliens and Bigfoot, because those were my favorite episodes. But there again, I think that's this thing where that's what the audience doesn't see. If they see the peacocking, they don't see that sometimes the peacocking is not confidence. It's because of the lack of confidence, or why did we get passed over? Why did this other show become bigger? Or why does this show make more money? And we just put this value, as a society, we put this big value. Like when people go, oh, I listen to true crime, I love Ashley Flowers. You're going to tell me that she's as good at looking and dissecting cases as Nick? Not a chance in hell. She does a 45-minute episode that's basically, a lot of the cases are Wikipedia versions of the case. I'm not going to hate on her because she makes more money doing it. The money doesn't make it better quality.
Well, there's a reason 2.5 Men was the #1 show in America for a decade. I think it's like for the masses. And what I had to decide a long time ago is like, I'm never going to be a top 10 show. And I have to be okay with that because I value the work that I'm putting out, and I value the audience who is engaged with that work. And like, as long as I can make a living and pay my staff and like, keep investing into this staff. I'd
love to have a staff. I'd love
you
to
have
have
Nick. He's enough.
He's enough of a staff. He definitely is a staff. No, but I think it's okay though too. But that doesn't mean that we should sit on this throne of righteousness and be like, well, Ashley Flowers doesn't deserve it. I saw her. She did an interview with John Ramsey. And I'm like, they would never give me that interview because they couldn't control what I'd ask him. They couldn't control if I would be confrontational or not. And then also, like, her network's putting out 5-6 shows a week. Oh my God, I'd hate to put out 5 or 6 shows a week. Like, and then like, and I went through a period of that too. You'd see these shows start taking off, and we got this really big bump from My Favorite Murder, but we were out for a while, and then people were like, "Oh man, I heard your guys' show on My Favorite Murder," and you're like, "Yeah," but at least they called us out. And my only criticism to Ashley Flowers is if you borrowed information or you listened to a podcast and got some information from it, why not shout them out? Why not? Yeah. And I've been less precious about that. I used to not want to talk about other true crime shows as if it was going to diminish my audience. And it's like, My Favorite Murder put out it was just this funny social media clip about their merchandise, and they're having their merchandise lady do all the ads, and she's just hilarious. And so I've been putting them in our stories. And then if I listen to, Tim and Lance or whoever, and went, that was a great episode, I've been sharing it in our stories, like, and not asking for a promo swap, just going, hey, this was good content, and if you're into this kind of content, cool. But I don't want to sit on this throne of, oh, I'm learning to love myself, so everybody else should. But I think it'd be good if we all could get to that place, not just as hosts, but the society and everybody, and then maybe that would stop some of these problems.
Well, one of the things I've noticed is one of the things I do to center myself when I'm having like, oh my gosh, this show did a 20-minute episode barely scratch the surface on this case. I spent hours and hours putting out this huge episode and they got so many more downloads. What I remind myself is if I wake up tomorrow and I have 5 times the number of downloads as I had the day before, what would I change about my show? And the answer is absolutely nothing. I'd be doing the same thing I'm doing now. So I'm just going to keep doing it.
Yeah, that's why I said, like, I think all this stuff just comes down to you have to just be as honest as you can with yourself and what you're trying to do. And I know everybody's going to be affected by it differently, but but like you said, I think there is a big difference now, because before, when we started the podcast, and I always tell this to Nick, the reason why I should get paid more than Nick is when we started, he's like, wouldn't that be awesome if we made a little money doing this? And I was like, yeah, like $500 a month. Because we both drove really shitty cars, and I thought $500 a month, we both could drive nicer cars because of the show. And Nick didn't hear me correctly, and Nick said $500 a year. That would be awesome. And we're like on the 6th episode. I'm like, this is a lot of work for $500 a year. But I mean, I think when you guys started, and when Generation Y started, and Sword and Scale, and even My Favorite Murder, and those, when those shows started, it wasn't like, I think the ladies in My Favorite Murder viewed it as, hey, we could talk about this and have a podcast, and this might help our comedy career.
Mm-hmm.
And then it turned into this other thing. And same, I just thought, oh, this would be fun to do this project, and if I could make $500 a month, that would be amazing. But now I think you're getting a lot of people that get into it for the wrong reason. Oh, if I start a show, maybe I can quit my job. It's like, you're going to quit your job to take on another job.
Yeah.
It's going to be a job,
Well, and even back then,
awesome job.
I didn't see a profit for 3 years, and I was consistently in the top 50. And I think, and it was way easier back then to make money than it is now, unless you're a celebrity. And I think that's the thing people don't realize. So many people are like, oh, I want to become a podcaster and make money. And I'm like, well, don't, because you're not going to.
Me and Nick differ on this. I think we should do a State of the Union every year to say, this is what's happening with the podcast. This is how our contract is broken down. I mean, they don't need to know every detail, but like, we're contractually obligated to release X amount of episodes per year. And so we talked about the John Benet Ramsey case. We thought it was going to be a 1-parter because we've talked about it a million times. Turned out to be a 3-parter, and we put two of the episodes behind a paywall, and we got people talking shit. Oh, you guys are just always grabbing at the money. It's like, no, we were only contractually obligated to release 1 episode that week, and we weren't going to give them extra episodes because they didn't deserve the extra, not the audience, but the ad agency didn't deserve the extra episodes. And they don't see that we weren't trying to upcharge anybody. We didn't think, oh, we're going to release these and make a bunch more money. We thought, no, we're going to release this content because we have it to the audience, but we're not going to give the advertisers a cut of this, because we've met our obligation.
I wish they could see the big picture, because when I tell people, like, I'm lucky if I make a penny for every download I get, they're shocked. And you're like, no, like, we're not raking in. I mean, even, I have a friend who was on one of the most successful TV shows in the history of television. And we were talking, and I was like, so are you going to like buy a house? And they were like, I can't afford to buy a house. And I'm like, you are top 5 billing in one of the biggest shows, and you can't afford to buy a house. I think people have such a distorted idea of like compensation and how money is moved around in the entertainment industry writ large, and by an extension, the podcast industry.
Yeah, and I think the other tough thing about what we're creating is if you put out a 45-minute episode, I think we did, because of our contract, we had multiple weeks that we put out a one-parter, and we're normally putting out 2 parts. And we got somebody saying, "Oh man, you guys are getting pretty lazy." It's like, well, we're not going to put out 2 episodes for no reason. Like, the case dictates how much content we will put out.
Right.
If the case lends itself to have all these talking points, well, that might be a 2-parter, might be a 4-parter. But they also don't see that sometimes that 45-minute episode took us 40 hours or more to create.
Yeah. I think that's the biggest thing. And I've tried to like delicately explain that to the audience over and over and over again, is like, for every 40 minutes of content you hear, expect that there's been 80 hours of work.
You think about doctors, and I would put, Charlie and Nick and Josh in this category. You guys have been, especially Josh, has been working on one case. So it's not just, even if you put out an episode of you just regurgitating information or thoughts that you've had about keys, well, how many hours are you at now?
20, and there's
20,000 hours, 30,000 hours.
There's no way to quantify at this point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's been so much. Yeah, I've definitely found that my listeners do respond to me, like you said, doing a State of the Union. I didn't do one last year because I was like so swamped and overwhelmed with other things. But most years I do a end of the year wrap up. The casual listener is not going to click play on it, but your core listeners will. And in those, I talk about any changes that were in the podcast, including this year. I'm going to include why I have more ads in my podcast now versus when I started. And I'm getting into how industry standards have changed, how
we're forced to,
and how Apple, changed how they did things. Everyone took a big hit on their downloads. So now we're getting paid less per episode. Like, if you put in an extra ad break, that's basically just to make what you used to make 2 years ago. So I put it all out there because, I don't put like how much money's in my bank account, but I put it pretty much everything else out there because I think people are interested in it. And I also think people will understand more if they know there's a reason behind it. And it's not just, oh, I was slacking off and that's why this isn't a 2-parter, or I'm just grabbing money, which is why I put in an extra, ad break. There is actually a reason, I promise.
Yeah. And I try to remind people that I didn't want to do this. I was forced to do this, and it's so funny because we've done 800 and some episodes on the main show, over 200 episodes of bonus content. So over 1,000 episodes. And there's not a single person out there on the internet calling the cops and saying, look, we know for a fact that this guy, Nick, kidnapped this drunk sailor without a boat. And he's forcing him to edit all of his thoughts on whatever he wants to talk about. And he's been in hiding. We don't even know if he's in the country anymore. And nobody has once come to my defense and called law enforcement to try to have me found. And it's kind of sad. I wrote a book about it, but Nick stole all that material. So releasing that later this year. Yeah, that's the biggest crime of the true crime space. Really, when you think about it.
I think like the perfect metaphor I have for what we do is every time we're at an event, like a true crime podcast festival or any big event where there's a lot of podcasters, on like the very first morning, you can kind of walk around and everybody has this look on their face of like, okay, I'm here. I'm on the floor. What do I do? What do I do? What do I say? And I think like that exemplifies how we exist in this space at large. Yeah. It's like, okay, I'm here.
Now
what do I do?
I also wonder if it's different for me than, because I don't feel like and look, I have friends of mine that will be like, the show would be nothing without you. I'm like, Nick would be just fine if I never talked once on the show. And there's been episodes that I've just sat there and thought, let's see how long I can go before he lets me talk. And he will just keep going. I mean, I think the longest like time that I had was like 20 some minutes of me not talking, and he just kept going. So I wonder if it's different because like Josh and Charlie, you're the face of it, and somebody could go, well, you're the face of this, but I'm the captain. I don't even own a boat. It makes 0 sense at all. So I think maybe I view things a little different because I don't even view it as my show. I view it as it's Nick's show. And we have some friends that have no clue about the podcast space. So one of my buddies, I don't know, about a year or so ago, he like pulled me aside and he was like, hey man, I know who the talented brother is. And the whole world one day is going to see that. Don't worry, man. Your time is going to come. I didn't have the heart to tell him, like, I'm not Nick's employee, But yeah, but maybe I feel different about it that way, or maybe it's also because my dad was a detective, and there's sometimes that I just think like my dad got paid nothing to go into a room with a stab victim that was stabbed 40 times and have to try to figure out what happened. And he was paid nothing, like we weren't broke, but there was no extra money to put in savings,
Right.
Yeah.
So I think sometimes, when we had this we vibe or something like that, it was like adult sex toys, joy toys, and like they wanted us to read that, and I just thought there's no way it's going to be graphic, so sure, we'll do it. Like, why not? Like, my dad got paid nothing. We should just be happy to do it. They were like the most graphic ads ever, and we had to contact them and say, we can't read this anymore. This is horribly embarrassing. But no, it's like maybe I think of it different that way, because I mean, even just like, and like you said, a lot of things are changing. We used to get a little bit of a bonus at the start of the contract, just to get things up and going and to get content going, and now those days are done. We don't get. But I remember getting the first bonus and telling my dad what it was, and he almost shit himself, because he's like, man, I actually did this for a living and they didn't pay me.
They didn't give me that much.
What are your highs and lows of this whole experience? Like the worst part of it, and it can be a specific thing or a general thing, and then like the best part of it, same, specific or general. Why don't you start, Captain?
I mean, it's going to sound a little sappy, but like Nick's my brother, and it's something that he like dreamed up, and like I said, he's gone above and beyond. I mean, the amount of times that he goes, hey, we got a couple $1,000s in the beer fund, let's donate that to Project Porchlight or National Center for Missing Children, and just how he's gone above and beyond trying to make a difference with the platform that we have. I mean, the amount of times that I go, I've never heard of this case. He goes, don't worry about it. I'm talking to this detective. They reached out. They're trying to get more people talking about the case. So just to be able to say that, like, he had this dream and I helped facilitate that. And he's then, instead of gone on and I mean, he's got a big head about himself now. And his shit don't stink, but he's also doing really good in the world, and so I'm proud of that. And I don't know, it's hard to say that there is lows, because like I said, I've struggled with depression and self-confidence and self-worth and all that stuff, and I actually think the negative comments help me confront that. And then I've also just met so many great people like Charlie and Josh and dare I say Bob Ruff, and guys from Generation Y, and And then the people that I haven't met personally, but like My Favorite Murder, like Karen is hilarious, and I just think is such a talent, and just so many smart people. And so I don't know. I don't know if I guess the worst part would be when you talk to the victim's family and you don't know if you can help them. I guess that'd be the worst part, you know. But other than that, I mean, I've had a great time doing it, you know, and I hope, you know, we can continue for another like 3 months, and then I'd like to retire.
What about you, Charlie?
I mean, as some people know, I had a podcast before Crimelines, and it ended poorly. My unlike the captain, my co-host wasn't diligently working on things, and that was, I mean, that would have to be absolutely the hardest, because it's not, you know, I ended a podcast, which I hate disappointing people, and so every message a listener sent that they were disappointed, like, I appreciated the support, but also every one of those was like a stab. And then also, I mean, literally walked away from thousands and thousands of dollars in upcoming ads that I then had to start over and start Crimelines, where I was barely making anything again. So starting over was really, really hard. Best thing ever, but really, really hard. So that's kind of my big downside of this entire journey. But honestly, it comes back to people again. With the best part is I've met so many listeners. I've networked with people I would never think I would ever have a conversation with, people who are experts in their field, whether, you know, it's forensics or they're psychiatrists or they're investigators, which has just been incredible. And then, you know, through podcasting, some podcasters have become, you know, my go-to people in my personal life too. If I have something coming up, you know, with my kids, like, I don't always just text everybody about podcasting. And so making, you know, really strong connections has been incredible.
My low is probably the bad ways that this has changed me. Like, I was thinking about, there was someone I was friends with like 15 years ago who like vaguely through the show and has vaguely come back into my life. And I was like thinking of the ways I've changed in that time. And I think because of the podcast, I'm like a harder person. I think I used to be a lot less cynical, a lot more open, a lot more willing to share myself with people than I am now. And that kind of bums me out. And I know that all comes from just like self-preservation from doing the work that we do.
Yeah.
And then I think the high is, yeah, the people. Of all the people, like being able to engage with people who have experienced traumas or experienced, you know, significant responses to the crimes that we discuss or crimes similar to the crimes we discuss. And then the podcasting friends I've made, like the fact that there are probably 20 true crime podcasters who I didn't know 6 years ago, who I now talk to every single day and vacation with and travel with, and like am excited to see when we go to these overwhelming, you know, events, is the coolest thing in the world. And like Charlie said, most of the time we're not even talking about podcasting. And I think because we all experience this very like niche, often isolating career, we're able to be a wholer version of ourselves with each other in a way that everyone else understands because we know this strange experience.
It's an experience that nobody else gets. And then like my experience is different than yours because I have a partner. So, you know, the guys in Generation Y, like we get along, but we've shared similar experiences, if that makes any sense.
Totally. And even, and like victims' families, like who you know, there are so many people who I've never met who I care about immensely. And I know I started this by saying it's made me a harder person, and it has, but it's also made me a much softer person.
But yeah, and I don't know if you guys would agree with this or not, but the true crime fan, and Nick used to talk about this fictitious person when we started. He just wanted to have like we want to put out the best show that we can that has the most factual information about a case that we can. And he would always talk about the true crime fan. And we've seen like a fad in the true crime world, but I think the true crime fans whether we agree on theories or suspects or whatever, like they're good people because they want the case solved. They want justice or closure for the victims. And that's crazy to see when you're at a crime con and you see thousands of these individuals that they're not just there to take a picture with you. They're also there to get information to try to help solve cases.
I couldn't agree more. And I think that's, oh, my alarm is going off. So I think that is the perfect way to end this conversation.
Alarm with Josh's, yeah. Well, we can end with Josh's alarm saying, let's go, move it along.
Shut the fuck up, you three.
I just want to say it's a privilege knowing you. I hope a ton of success. We'll all get our flowers, no pun intended, in 2025.
Same. And I hope that Nick lets you out of the garage at some point, Captain.
Please help.
Happy holidays, everyone. And this has been really lovely. I love doing these conversations with people because you never know what's going to come.